an understatement, to say the least. The image here is crucial to me and has been for a while in the clergy abuse crisis, in terms of how we have felt in the last 15, 20 years, especially in the developed nations of the world, and having these revelations about harm to beloved children by those who in fact are disciples of Christ and who should protect them. But I want you to know that this image now, post-COVID, is even more powerful than ever before. And it's not just that the image has, this is the story, you see the boat going down. You see that with the waves crashing and the apostles thinking they were going to be lost forever, Jesus asks Peter to walk to him on the water. Instead of being engulfed, he says, "Come to me," and reaches his hand out for him. And the amazing image here, thinking of us today, not only from the experience of the abuse crisis, but in the COVID experience, is this: we can feel totally overwhelmed by what's going on around us in the world and in our church, where some of the great images and stories of our church now, in fact, have been turned to issues of wrongdoing, not doing good. But the image that's powerful as we move now, because you'll see, and especially for those of you who participate tomorrow when we deal with this in detail, the message is, as long as Peter took off on top of the water with his eyes on Jesus, he stayed afloat. The minute he looked down and said, "Oh God, I'm walking on water," down he went. So in this story, when we hear the disciples, apostles saying, "Lord, save us, we're perishing," remember, Jesus says, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" As long as we can look to Jesus, we in fact will be saved. We will not be overwhelmed. Peter mentioned the notion of prophecy. Very powerful image, and we're going to see a bit today and again in detail tomorrow, how often Pope Francis uses the image of the prophetic. And he is calling us to, in fact, a prophetic moment in the church, a prophetic moment in the church. But this work from the famous Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar, not a Catholic, talks about prophetic criticism and prophetic imagination. Because we are at a time where, in fact, we need the prophetic. We need to be able to criticize in the way in which the prophets did, which is not predicting the future, that ridiculous modern interpretation, but the prophets held up to the people who they were called to be and demanded that they repent. Remember who God has called you to be, and repent and renew. So, in order to be a prophet who can in fact restore a people to its vision, the first we have to have is a long and available memory. We have to be able to remember the history of salvation, the history of our sinfulness, the history of God's grace available to us. And we'll see, we're going to look at the history of the abuse crisis very briefly tonight. But the prophetic is also about a sense of pain and loss. The real prophet begins work in lament. And if there was ever a time when I've come to a whole new understanding of lamentation, not only from the abuse crisis, but in the past 6 months in this pandemic. What prophets need to do with the memory of our sinfulness as well as the memory of being graced with the sense of pain, is we have to have what Brueggemann calls the active practice of hope. We'll see in a bit how Pope Francis names this issue. And then look at the last point, because it's why we're doing what we're doing here tonight. And I'm so happy that so many of you are willing to help do this. We need an effective mode of discourse. As Peter said, we have got together to break the silence, secrecy, and denial on the issues that the clergy abuse crisis has shown us about the church, and how the church is not witnessing the mission, words, and witness of Jesus himself. Pope Francis put this so beautifully. He said, remember, we need the prophetic in our time, but the obstacles to the prophetic are, and this is his quote, narcissism makes you look at yourself constantly in the mirror. Discouragement leads to complaining, and pessimism to thinking everything is dark and bleak. These three attitudes close the door to the Holy Spirit. To the Holy Spirit. The hope we have is in the power of the Spirit. As we reflect on this issue, we are in a very particular situation of what the Catholic Marist priest, Father Jerry Arbuckle, a social anthropologist, calls grief overload. In medicine, we call it tragedy fatigue, those who do battlefield medicine and the like. As we came into 2020 as a church, we were bombarded, and had been for over 15 years dramatically, and we'll see 30 years if you go back to the Newfoundland experience, with this sense of the church has failed, the church has failed, the church has failed, men of God have sinned, leaders. The experience that we had, and again, bombarded by the media, every story everywhere, was of enormous loss in belief in the church as a place of holiness. Moving into pandemic, we now have a situation where so many of the things that have been problematic are now highlighted as issues that we have to deal with, but we're not dealing with all of our situation of grief from a situation of strength. We come into the extra challenges of pandemic having been overloaded with grief, and it affects our ability to be resilient. So Pope Francis' letter in 2018 to the people of God was crucial, and it's why I thank every one of you who have participated today, and those of you who participate tomorrow, and continue this conversation wherever you are. Every one of the baptized should feel involved in the ecclesial and social change that we so greatly need. This change calls for a personal and communal conversion that makes us see things as the Lord does. To see things as the Lord does, to be where the Lord wants us to be, to experience a conversion of heart in his presence. I want to share with you why I am committed in this journey. Because while the Holy Father is asking all of us, every one of the baptized, to be involved, the reality is, especially in this time of experience of lockdown from liturgy and closure of religious activities, many in the last 10 years and in the last 6 months have left the church and will never return. I'm committed to this because I love the church, but not necessarily what the church as an institution and organization has done. because I believe in what Jesus has said and how he has witnessed to the care of the vulnerable, particularly children, my ministry in the church and in my religious community. I want you to know that when I speak of lament in this issue, I go back to involvement here in 1989 and 90. And so 30 years ago, the Newfoundland Commission of Inquiry in St. John's, Newfoundland. I show you this particular journey from the perspective of the Canadian Church, because I think it's crucial for you to understand that the Canadian Church has been remarkable in understanding what I, as a diagnostician, call the underlying systemic and cultural reasons why the abuse crisis has occurred and has gone on for as long as it has. This Commission of Inquiry in Newfoundland, with the devastation, when Archbishop Alphonsus Penny asked me to come, 5 people on a Commission of Inquiry, we published our report unexpurgated, exactly as we delivered it. The commission was led by an Anglican layman. Brilliant maneuver, former Lieutenant Governor of Newfoundland. 2 things happened there that made me commit my whole life. My whole life now to this issue. 1, we did an academic review and I understood something of the harms in a way that dealing with individual children who've been sexually abused had never occurred to me. But we decided that we would go to the parishes where the abuse had occurred and we would listen to their pain. Listen to their pain. Listen to the victims. In that inquiry, what we concluded, because Bishop Penny had asked us, what happened here? 2 priests at that time incarcerated. This is after the Mount Cashel institutional abuse. 40 priests under investigation. I mean, Catholic Newfoundland was decimated. Our commission conclusion in the 1990 report was, there's no one single answer. There are a number of issues that need further study. These are abuse of power, silence and secrecy, protection of reputation, passive laity, the issues that here in 2020, I'm still working at. But you need to understand this response. And then I was on the ad hoc committee for the 1990-1992 Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. They took all of the lessons from Newfoundland, And in fact, the ad hoc committee produced the first national guidelines in the world. We were ahead of the American Church, but they also repeated the importance of the systemic and cultural issues underlying how did it happen and why was the response to it so inadequate. I wrote my first book in 2012 after the arrest of the former Bishop Raymond Lahi, who was arrested and who in fact had gone to my neighboring diocese of Antigonish after horrendous sexual abuse there. In 2014 to 18, again, now under the chairmanship, I actually have my own bishop, Anthony Mancini. For 4 years, I was on the ad hoc committee for the CCCB, produced Protecting Minors from Sexual Abuse. The principles that we generated in that accountability, mutual responsibility, transparency, were the ones that they used to organize, Pope Francis used to organize the 2019 summit. But again, and I'll show you a quote in a minute, the Canadian Church is not simply talking about policies and protocols. It's talking about understanding what is it about the church that has been revealed in the way in which it has dealt with this issue. And then 2019, still unhealed, and I'm now writing prophetic possibilities for the post-pandemic church, if I can ever finish it. I want you to see this wonderful quote from our bishop. These are our Canadian bishops. Preventing sexual abuse must be a present concern and a future goal for the church and society. The goal of prevention is first and foremost a call to conversion, identifying long-standing practices linked with sexual abuse and transforming those practices, ensuring that they are more closely aligned with the gospel and the church mission. Brilliant. Again, requiring that we in fact go deeper and don't simply look at a superficial answer, but in fact go deeper into the reality. We don't have time this evening to go into depth on the history, but the point I want you to be very, very clear about is this is not a recent history. In fact, the early history of this, the clergy abuse of minors goes back to first mention in 306 at the Council of Elvira. A whole major activity in the renewal of the church occurred under St. Peter Damian, and his book, the Book of Gomorrah, dealing again with abuse, sexual abuse by clergy, was in 1140. So this idea that there was sexual license in Western civilization, and that's what this is about. Abuse happens because we sin, but abuse goes on happening and is facilitated or not dealt with because of systemic and cultural responses. In the 1970s, when I was doing my pediatric residency, we need to remember this. The abuse of children, whether it's sexual abuse in sweat houses, or child soldiers, it's gone on for throughout human history. But we haven't, it was really only in the 1970s in the West, in North America in particular, where we began to realize this is not just all right, that this was a serious issue for societies, and of course, a very serious issue for the church. But you need to remember that, because even now when we look at some of the issues, racism, colonialism, these things that are now being revealed, retrospective moral judgment can be difficult, but at the same time, there needs to be a way for us to get under some of these historical realities to determine what we should have known or the way we should have responded if we had been paying attention to the gospel. I now, in my history, I talk about the Pope Francis era, and I talk about the Pope Francis era because I love this Holy Father, though, as some of you may have heard me say before, I really want to have a chat with him about women. But I love this Pope because not only is he a pastor, but people seem to miss that he has recognized systemic and cultural issues from the beginning of his papacy. He's talked about the temptations of the church. He's talked about the diseases of leadership. He, in fact, has been repeatedly calling us to personal conversion. So if we look at this long history, remember, there's the harm to the victims, and then there's the leadership response to the harm for individuals and then for the global situation. So the lessons are about abuse of power, trust, and sacred office. And in fact, Pope Francis is the abuse of conscience, that you will see that in the dynamics in a minute. We learned profound harm to children and youth. Profound harm to children and youth. We learned the dominance of secrecy, silence, and denial to avoid scandal, but not scandalon in the biblical sense, which is an obstacle to God, but in the modern sense of reputational loss. Reputational loss. From the history, we see that even when we started to respond, we responded with canons, policies, and protocols. Bureaucratic responses, absolutely necessary for safeguarding, but as our philosophy colleagues would tell us, not sufficient for long-term prevention. Long-term prevention requires this conversion of heart for individuals and for the church, and then a failure to address underlying practices. So when Sister Nuala, or Dr. Kenny, depending on who I am, makes the primary diagnosis underneath everything else, and tomorrow we'll go through some of it's about sexuality, homosexuality, celibacy, all of those have a role. They're not the cause. The primary diagnosis of the sexual abuse of the minors, children and youth, and other vulnerable by the clergy is a contradiction to Jesus's mission, words, and witness. Think of the amazing countercultural interaction of Jesus with children. This is the gentle Jesus, and this is what he says. Anyone who is an obstacle to bring down one of these little ones who have faith in me would be better drowned in the depths of the sea with a great millstone around his neck. One of the harshest words from Jesus, telling us how seriously he takes this issue. And in fact, we'll see tomorrow, not in a small part, because of what he says about children. Unless we become like children, it is to children that the kingdom of God belongs. What does that mean? And what is that kind of harm happening when, in fact, it affects the individual so they can never again trust in not just the church, they can never again trust in God. So Francis rightly says, if we look at where we are, I see that the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol or about his blood sugar. Those are important. But at the field hospital, think of the doctors that you've seen on television around the world, from Rome to New York to Quebec, doctors overwhelmed by the number of COVID patients, not able to, in fact, help all. That's a field hospital. You have to heal the wounds, then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, heal the wounds. It's not as if we did not respond to the crisis. In fact, the church, the Roman Catholic Church today, I can reasonably well state, has probably more regulation about safeguarding environments and protective educational programs about protection from abuse than any other institution or organization. But policies, protocols, and practices as a promotion of safe ministry environments, again, necessary but not sufficient. These short-term protective responses focused on individuals in terms of originally trying to figure out who are the offenders, clergy likely at risk of offending, but they were focused on individuals only. Long-term prevention, as the CCCB said in its quote I shared, requires deeper ecclesial renewal of underlying systemic and cultural factors. So just remember, listening to victims. The harms are short-term when it occurs in childhood, but with long-term broken lives that I can do two whole hours simply cataloging for you the depth of devastation because of the kind of interference at the developmental stage of youth when it is sexual abuse by a person in position of power. And tragically, there's what I call double damage to victims of clergy abuse. Because the priest represents Christ. They lose spiritual solace and healing. There's scandal, as I said, in the biblical sense. And then when there's ongoing silence and denial, and this is one of the issues that we really do have to deal with in detail in our world today. First, we have so many Catholics who don't want to talk about it. We have bishops and priests, so we're so tired and burnt out, they can't talk about it anymore. But if we, in fact, continue ongoing silence and denial about the pain and about the issues, it won't go away because we don't talk about it. An American sociologist in the late 70s and 80s began to look at this issue. And here I'm just going to rapidly show you. He attempted to understand what he calls the dynamics or the preconditions for an adult to offend sexually against a child or youth. I mean, it was intuitive. This one thing that you don't do is this would seem to be a taboo that ought cross all lines and cultures. He posited in the secular realm 4 preconditions. There has to be a motivation to abuse. There has to be overcoming of internal inhibitions. There has to be overcoming of external factors, and there has to be overcoming of the victim's resistance. Now, we're going to just look at these far too rapidly, but I want you to begin to think about these because it's in the church-specific factors that each and every one of us has to begin to reflect on them, look at our role in them, look at how we, priests, clergy, laity together, men and women in the church, can in fact begin to address these issues so that we can do the long-term prevention. So the motivation to abuse, again, a mature adult does not sexually have sexual activity with a child or a youth. So psychological, psychosexual immaturity, emotional congruence with the victim, deviant sexual arousal, and then the blockage of sexual relationships. So there's a whole host of issues that we have to think of that are church specific. But this is crucially important because here what we have to pay attention to is not only the selection of priests and where they're formed, huge amount of discussion in the literature on the seminary and how the seminary both gives them a special sense of self and also, in fact, gives them great harm in not allowing the continuation of their human development and comfort with intimacy, non-genital intimacy. But in fact, there are also profound issues, and I know this from knowing and loving a number of bishops and priests over my lifetime, good men, who in fact will say the expectations that we have had of priests and bishops, the inability for ordinary kinds of support is a huge ongoing problem. How can we respond? We have to overcome internal inhibitions. And here we used alcohol. Here the big church issue is the creation of excuses and justifications. Alcohol, huge problem. Lonely priests, especially, look at what we're doing in this day and age. We have priests with more parishes than ever before, spread out all kinds of course they're using alcohol. It in fact, it is a precipitant for abuse in all situations. But the whole issue of their special status This is not good for other people to do, but God wants me to do it. I mean, even blasphemy and sacrilege. This is a huge area for us to begin to reflect on. How did that happen? Now, I want you to remember, these were the dynamics that were identified in 1980, and we're going to see how so many of these are now very different. But it's the underlying factor we need to pay attention to. Overcoming external factors. During the high time of all of this abuse, there was unlimited access of clergy to children, particularly boys. Nobody thought anything of the priest taking 4 or 5 fellas down to a summer camp. But what we have to pay attention to is the issue of all of us, just as with COVID, everyone has to be involved in protection. So as we look at this abuse crisis, it's longstanding, it's created profound harm, and we'll see tomorrow, for those of you who are there, when we talk about clericalism and this priests on pedestal history that we had, that a priest on a pedestal can be crying and nobody hears him. He can be bleeding and nobody can stop the flow. The pedestal is the worst place to be for human support and love and mutual interaction. So Pope Francis asks us to think about what were in history the factors, and then he's asking us to commit to a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church is transforming everything, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably challenged for the evangelization of today's world, rather than for her self-preservation. I can tell you that one of the lessons from COVID is self-preservation anywhere is impossible, but you can try. While the history showed us many things to reflect upon in terms of how the church is and functioned, the contemporary context is a very serious one. For us to maintain that hope that is necessary for the prophetic and necessary for us to continue to be involved in the discussion and sharing and listening necessary for real healing. So one of our problems is grief overload and tragedy fatigue. Laity feel totally powerless, but I'll tell you this is a little secret that I've learned, especially since 2012, when I wrote my first book, and I've done clergy study days. I think it's in 27 dioceses in the country between 2012 and 2018. Bishops and priests, in fact, feel tragedy fatigue, feel really overwhelmed. And in fact, in this day and age, I know absolutely clearly that the issue of restructuring parishes, bankruptcy, Peter talked about our own diocese for growing up, the number of dioceses in this country, the ongoing lawsuits. These are occupying and demanding so much time and attention from our bishops, who are overwhelmed by the issue. But the ability for our priests and bishops to openly have conversation about this is really, really limited. That's why I am so happy for you that Bishop of Grattan's participating in this. He won't agree with everything I say, but I think he does know I love the church, and I am trying to help healing. And I want to say how wonderful it is that he's in the conversation, because I want to help him, and we all need to commit. We have to have no more denial of how serious this is. We have to commit to real dialogue, and we have to, in fact, now move from identification of pathology, mine and that of Pope Francis himself, and personal and ecclesial conversion. So if we were to look then at, as I end, with prophetic possibilities, one of the things that we know from the history of salvation, history of the Jewish people, and the times when, in fact, the prophets were called to call them back to God and being God's people, is that every time they failed and then returned to the Lord, there was a new beginning. And I think that the prophetic possibilities, the great prophet Jeremiah captured well. See, the days are coming. It is Yahweh who speaks, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. Deep within them I will plant my law, writing it on their hearts. Then I will be their God, and they will be my people. It is not possible, even if we wanted to go back to the glory days of the church. Those were the days where abuse of power was rampant. We cannot go back there, nor should we. The issue is, will we take this time of devastation, this Calvary moment of death, to in fact return to the Lord as the people of the resurrection through the power of the Holy Spirit? That's the challenge. And all I can tell you is, I'm in there as long as the Lord gives me ability to help people open to discuss the issue and to support and encourage. Every one of us is needed. And most important, when we think we're perishing, Jesus says, why are you afraid, you of little faith? Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sister Nuala. I'm still processing much of that. It was really a lot of information to take in, really powerful. So what we're going to do at this point is we still have about half an hour for Sister Nuala to answer questions from the audience. So if someone in the audience has a question, you want to make a comment, what you're asked to do is to send me, Peter Baltutis, a private message. And then in my private chat, I'll start to see the questions, and then I'll ask them to our keynote speaker for this evening. I've already had a few trickle in, and so I'll start with these. And as she's answering, feel free to add your questions to me privately. The first question I got from two people, and I'll summarize it the best I can, is, in short, so what can we do? So as far as I know, the vast majority of people in our audience tonight are not bishops, they're not priests, they are people who are the lay faithful. So the question is, now that we're aware of this problem and we acknowledge there's a problem, which is probably the first step, what can we as lay people tangibly do? And perhaps, I know we have a few clergy in our audience, priests and at least one bishop. So if you want to add things for them too, that'd be wonderful. But what can we do? How are we called to respond to this message?
All right, well, what we have to do is to find this discourse that is required for the prophetic, and to break through the silence and denial. We have to recognize, and all of us need to be involved. And this, tomorrow we're going to talk about dialogue and what we've learned about lack of dialogue in our church. But it's dialogue in a Trinitarian understanding. It's a dialogue that is opening us to a mutual way of understanding and empowering each other. So one of the things that has happened, we have to stop this polarizing, judgmental kind of discourse, liberals, conservative, however we do that, we have to find ways to, first of all, encourage dialogue in the way Pope Francis reminds us. It's not just about engaging in conversation, it's listening, and it's really hearing. It's really listening intently. So anything and everything that can be done to encourage a discussion at the parish and diocesan level. I think one of the hardest things, and it flows from what I've said, is we sometimes have lay groups, and we have whatever the priests and bishops are doing when they're together. We need to be able to bridge the gap. So ways in which we try to develop supports, but they're also practical things like the new guidelines on pastoral conversion. What about the parish councils? What about diocesan pastoral councils? What about this whole issue of synods and the involvement? We have to have practical ways that we can begin now to support each other. At the level of the deeper theology, that's where we have to pray together and raise these underlying issues. Because I'm not a theologian. I know a lot of theology at this stage in my life, more than I had ever thought I would. But unless we begin to have a way of sharing with each other our sense of loss and commit all of us to look at the words, witness, mission of Jesus as the standard by which we judge. So I can only tell you as a teacher, and just the first place you've got to go is break the silence, but break it in a respectful manner. Second, recognize we're all hurting. And sometimes the people that you think that this is the bishop. Hey, he's so arrogant. He's insensitive. Sorry, this is not you, Bishop Moran. This is in general. But making these incredible remarks, and you want to say, did you ever stop for a minute to try to think inside what this guy's going through? Do you know how difficult it is to be a bishop? Now, I'm not excusing him. I'm just saying, how would the Lord want us? He would want us to recognize and find ways, because if we are only making judgment statements, then we're not helping each other.
Excellent. Thank you, Nuala. A bunch more questions coming in. So one of them is a two-part question, and I'll do my best to sort of conflate them together. I think it's really a good one. And I'll read the question to you directly. I'm really interested to hear your advice on how the church, both leaders and the laity, what should we be doing to respond to the personal and cultural grief overload of 2020? And obviously, we're talking not just about COVID pandemic, where we're seeing, movements like against racial injustice, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. It seems, and it's almost for my students in the audience, these have been, the subject of many memes. Just what's 2020 going to bring next? It seems as if issues are compounding, and this is taking a heavy psychological, emotional, and spiritual toll on all of us. As a physician, as a spiritual person, what are ways that we can start, or hopefully in a healthy way, manage this grief overload?
Look, you do know, I mean, because I though I don't have my medical license anymore, but I still am on the medical Doctors Nova Scotia list. So I get every night an update on all kinds of stuff. But one of the big things that Doctors Nova Scotia has done, and the other programs across the country for doctors, so it's by way of an example, is they have now all kinds of courses, all kinds of hotlines, precisely for the issue of stress, of this burnout, of this sense of being overloaded and overwhelmed. Most provinces in our country have actually provincial government hotlines now for people whose psychiatric illness, despair, suicide. Tomorrow, the number of these horrific situations that occur, increasing in COVID, is enormous. I think this is where lamentation meets atonement. I know, and I know for in my own diocese, and I know many other dioceses, where they have had, before the COVID thing, attempts at diocesan-wide events, and the purpose of them was to come and share our sorrow and grief over the abuse crisis. I mean, I know a number of bishops who did that. I know, so that I know for sure. We need now to realize that even though we're distant, and you know, some churches are opening up, as you got some people, absolutely. The chapter in the new book about liturgy and lockdown is entitled "Out of Practice," and it's not out of practice like I lost my tennis swing. It's we stopped something that was familiar, and we're never going to go back again. So what we need to do is find ways to allow us to have experiences where we can see lament in my own. Bishop Tony Mancini said this to me one day when I was going on about stuff, and I talked about lament, and Bishop Tony said to me, he said, "Nuala, you know, the one thing I like about lament is it lets you say you're angry with God. It legitimates it. It says, you're God, why did you let this happen to me?" Because anger is also mixed up with our loss. So that question is bang on, an opportunity for us to even get under what I'm going to talk about tomorrow is all the prayer language that suddenly emerged during COVID. You know, rock stars were talking about praying. What were they talking about? What do they mean? Who is the God they're praying to? So there are the importance of our not saying prayers. The prayers are wonderful, but coming together in this lament. And again, Father Arbuckle has two terrific books on this, that it's absolutely necessary. I mean, so think of it this way. You know, and of course the experience of loss of funerals and the death and people not being able to accompany their loved ones because of the lockdown, a huge loss of the sacraments, but a huge personal loss in not being able to be there with your loved ones who were dying or who were very sick. And what we know is, if you do not have an experience of completion to celebrate a life, you can never move on. So we absolutely need new ways to allow ourselves to learn new prayers. And those prayers, the final big point for me, is they also allow us to express together this vulnerability that we have experienced. Because it's only when we experience that, then we really know the vulnerability of Jesus Christ himself, who emptied himself to become like us, died, suffering for us. That's the church of vulnerability. That's the church of the love of God.
Thank you. Lots of questions are pouring in, so I'll do my best to make sure I can screen them the best I can. So two people asked similar questions, and the question is there anything we can do to help support our bishops and our priests in the church that are suffering through this? And then I guess a similar question is, how are we supposed to respond to false accusations against clergy?
Okay, let me do the last one very briefly, and then Bishop McGrattan, I'm going to punt this one to you. I think you're the one that could answer even better than any of my attempts. False accusations. So, yes, there are false accusations, and we've seen some major ones, right? But they are, in fact, very rare. The issue about them that becomes the problem is that because we have sinned and are now under this legal scrutiny in an intense way. So, for example, a reasonable accusation, credible accusation, I think is the proper terminology. And a priest gets taken out and suspended until the investigation. The investigation can take ages. I know a priest, it's 2.5 years, but he's now caught in all kinds of other things. And I mean, so the ordinary justice issues and due process, they themselves have now, it's an example of violence breeds violence. If in fact you sin, you did, then the whole situation turns into this issue of retribution. And it's a horrible situation. But I will say to you, from the perspective of victims, if you listen to them and you listen to the number of them and all of those who've still never been able to say anything for offenses that are still ongoing, which is what I cannot understand at all. I mean, that shows you the depth of some people's pathology. But this is an issue that is serious. So I think Bishop McGrattan, when he sums up, I mean, I hope he can tell us what we could do to help him and his brother bishops and priests.
Thank you. Another question came in, is that oftentimes the clergy sexual abuse crisis is attributed to homosexuality amongst the clergy. How do you respond to that?
No. A mature homosexual is no more likely to offend against a minor than a mature heterosexual. Now, it is true, because of course the Cardinal McCarrick thing blew this right up in everybody's faces, even in the midst of Francis trying to deal with this issue. It is true that historically in the Roman Catholic clergy, certainly within the last 100, 150 years in the West, we have had a large number of men who are homosexual. Of course we did. If you were a good Catholic boy and you knew yourself to be homosexual and you didn't want your mama to be pestering you about why are you not going to give her grandchildren. I mean, I'm being partly facetious over a very serious issue, but you know what I'm describing. They became priests. I know homosexual priests, good, holy men. Now, what we will say is, the fact is, if they then entered a clerical culture, trained in seminary only with men in a closed environment, and then living only with men, and now temptations can in fact arise. So it's a complex issue, but it's not the answer to the question of sexual abuse of minors. Don't scapegoat persons who are homosexual.
Okay, good. Another question that was being asked is, having been involved in this work since the 1980s, do you see this issue getting better? Are you more hopeful, or are you more discouraged after being involved in this now for several decades?
Are you asking me that tonight or last night? And I'm not being facetious about this. I have literally, when I say about lament, I mean, I have literally had dark nights of the soul on this thing. Because as I said, I love the church. But I try to be a disciple of Jesus. I love kids. I became a baby doctor. I dealt with sick and dying children, and as well as those who are, and can't even imagine that you would not, at any possibility that they might be harmed, that you might not get in there. I mean, and the delay, it's the delay. and again, my own bishop, over the years, I've said, Bishop Tony, why are they taking so long? He'd say, Nuala, it's a different culture. You're a doctor. I said, you bet your boots I'm a doctor. If there was a possibility that this little kid was going to get worse in the next 6 hours, I'm in there now. I don't wait. I do have this frustration, but I will tell you, so many issues now have become, there's no hiding anymore. The people who are denying are in some pathological state. And we could name people in great positions of power outside the church who are in denial, who are now in deep trouble. Denial is a pathological state. But I can tell you that I live in hope. This is a Calvary moment for us. And I believe in the power of the Holy Spirit. I believe in the power of the Holy Spirit. That's what my answer is today.
Thank you. No, thank you for your honesty. A question came in as a follow-up to the previous question. How much do you think priestly celibacy has been a factor in this issue?
Okay. All right. So good. Another one of the I have a whole lecture on the wrong diagnoses using diagnostic metaphor. Okay. So celibacy in and of itself, again, is not a factor. The vast majority of people who offend against children in society as a whole are in fact not celibate. They're sexually practicing, mostly heterosexuals. But mandatory celibacy. So I'm making a distinction between celibacy as I'm a religious. So think of all the religious priests that there are. When we enter a religious community and take our vows, those vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, the classic vows, or some other orders have a couple of extras. I'm intentionally taking that on as one of the vows. Priests who want to serve the people in a parish, secular priests, that's the proper term for them, the mandatory celibacy, and this is where this is one of the things where I want to talk to Francis about women, and I want to talk to the Holy Father about mandatory celibacy in the Latin Rite. May I say that again? In the Latin Rite. 31 of the 33 rites of the Catholic Church in full communion with the Holy Father. 31 of 33 have married clergy. Look at the ordinariate for the Anglicans and now Anglicans who convert, all right? It is absurd. And there's a whole bunch of cardinals and others insisting on celibacy being essential. It's not essential. Or all those other priests practicing who are married would in fact, they're the ones who be sinning. So it's a contradiction that is so stark that it's something, and that's why when the Amazonian Synod, even just starting with viri probati, right? The married men who are, but this issue, there are so many things where it's an example of when you've been enculturated to a certain set of beliefs, even when the facts of the matter are showing you that this is contradiction, you can't see it. You're embedded in a cultural way of thinking.
Excellent. Another question coming in. Well, first, a quick question is we've had 2 requests. Would you be comfortable sharing your slides with people in the audience tonight? Because some people wanted to see some of the quotes you used.
Yes.
Okay. So it's
more than happy.
Okay.
More than happy.
So St. Mary's University, we have a copy of her slides. We can send them out to all those that signed up tonight. So thank you for your generosity. Second question is asking, I'll try and paraphrase it. So are there proactive things that we can do to try to make sure that clergy are acting appropriately even with parishioners, in a sense, are there things that we can do proactively to make sure that clergy stay in their proper boundaries of appropriate relationships?
So I love the person who asked the question, but I don't like the language in the question. Already, that you're just flipping what are the proper boundaries for when? What are the question? The question is about the way I like to think of the question is how can we restore, promote healthy relationships between clergy and laity and men and women in the church. And please understand, I absolutely believe that there are special functions that go with ordination. And by the way, administration of the finances don't go with ordination; they go with canon law. But no, there are special functions. I'm a doctor. I assure you, I do not want people operating on one of my kids by going out on the street and saying, "Would anyone like to come and help perform this surgery?" Absolutely not. There's special function. There's special gifts. Our language is special charisms. What I love is the language, and I think it's from Lumen Gentium, that the relationship between clergy and laity should be that of mutual need. There are all kinds of needs in the church, and each of us needs to contribute our charism. See, that's the other thing that has been part of our problem. On the one hand, Catholic laity have been taught to be passive. And we talk about this stuff, but we don't talk about it in the right place. On the other hand, when we begin, and I have a couple of quotes, if you've read the other book, Vehementor nos, I forget which pope that was now. I mean, frankly says the church is an unequal society. I mean, the celebration of the year of the priest, for the catechism, the Vatican I catechism, priests being in their position as representative of Jesus Christ are like angels and even gods. What? What does Jesus say? Learn from me because I am meek and humble of heart. It's servant leadership. So it's not that I believe that there should be no structure and the buck has to stop someplace, but make sure it's the right issue that's stopping at the right place. And the issue should be mutual need.
Good. So we've exhausted all of the questions that have been submitted in the chat. So we still have about 2 or 3 more minutes. So this will be the last call if anyone has any questions. All right, we just had one trickle in right now. Okay, so here's a question that I think maybe you brought on yourself. Sister Nuala has twice mentioned that she wishes to speak to Pope Francis about women in the church. Would she care to expand on what she'd like to bring to his attention?
I think Pope Francis, whom I'm saying, I love this Pope. From the minute he walked out on that balcony, I was his. But he is an Argentinian celibate male. Now, it's interesting because it's only recently, actually, in watching the 2 popes, and I had read a biography, that I had any idea that he had this very interesting history before he became a priest and whatever. So it's not that he doesn't know women and had longer, he didn't go to a junior seminary type experience, but he still is a Latin from Latin America of his era. And he keeps talking about the feminine and feminine qualities. And he really does see women, and he's totally bought into even the theological notion of the relationship of men and women is they complement each other. And that's got all kinds of roots in biology of complementarity. One is the powerful one is the receiver, but not equality. And though he has this fabulous line that I'm actually going to use tomorrow when I talk about this. He says, you know, I mean, that if we look at the issue, there are languages and ways of speaking that in fact meant something in a certain time period, and they don't mean that today. So he's still talking about, you know, his women's work is the appropriate work for women is barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen, in a Catholic version. So you do know. So whoever asked that question, one of the things I am desperately waiting for is the encyclical coming out on Sunday. I cannot believe he's actually going to call it Fratelli Tutti. Fratelli Tutti, not Fratelli e Sorelli Tutti. And then there's all kinds of writing now about justifying, well, yeah, but he's quoting fraternity, and that was Francis. That's exactly when the Holy Father needs to read his own writings, because Francis was writing when the term fraternity in the medieval time period had a certain cultural understanding. The desperate thing I'm worried about is that all of the fabulous stuff I know he's going to say about justice and the economy, it's going to be lost, because the media is only going to pick up on, here he is again, Fratelli Tutti. And all of my women friends who are barely hanging in there with the church because of what they've just, they're not going to stick with the importance. But even if he had changed his mind, enough people have had to be telling him, don't name it that. And by the way, anyway.
Thank you for your candor. So a good question came in. You mentioned earlier that you've been to, I believe, it was 27 different dioceses doing priest study days. The question is, how do the clergy respond to your message? You present your presentations, you have 2 excellent books out. How do the clergy, priests and bishops, respond to your message?
Well, in the first, so most of this was immediately after my 2012 book, Healing the Church. Yeah, that's it. That's the first one. Yeah, that's the first one. And that was written to try and take these issues and provide a format that you see, it's a workbook. The folks at Novellis helped me actually create it as a workbook so it could be used for discussion. I would say, so it may not be, I think it might be 24, but anyway, it was a large number in full clergy study days. So some of them for 2 days, I did 2 days. And the bishops who invited me, who attended, and their clergy, set a different tone in general. For all of those, and it wasn't a strategy, it's because I hope you realize, I feel a very specific affinity for the way in which all of this has affected our priests. They're not my first concern, the victims are, but they're my concern. They're my concern. I mean, I remember the first time I heard one of the fellows in Newfoundland say, he no longer anywhere wears his collar. I remember I was out west, and it wasn't the Calgary airport, I think it was Edmonton. I had been at some meeting, and there was some bishop's thing that had gone on, was sitting, waiting for the plane to Toronto on the way home, saw a bishop come in and sit down, and I recognized him, so I was putting my stuff together to go up and go over and say hello. A mother and about a 7 or 8 year old boy were looking for seats. They saw seats, and she went over, and as soon as she stood in front of him and realized he had a collar on, she walked away. Well, I moved so fast to go and sit next to that guy. That's not the way we're supposed to be. I forgot what the rest of the question was.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a very poignant story. I realize we've kept you talking now for about almost well over an hour. You're very generous. So usually,
Peter, just a reminder to everybody, it's now 5 minutes after 10 Halifax time, and I'm not a night person.
Yeah. So we'll end with this question is, my students who are in the audience tonight know every time a student in my class gives a presentation, the last question I always ask them is, so what's the big takeaway you want us to have from your presentation? So Sister Nuala, after talking with us and sharing your wisdom, what's the one big takeaway you want us to take away from our time with you tonight?
Hang in there, hang in there, hang in there. There is a God, there is a resurrection. Pope Francis is right. Just as we learned, one person not doing the right thing can enhance the infection rate in COVID. Each of us has a responsibility. And unless we all fulfill our responsibility, I mean, this is what do we say? We understand if one suffers in the body of Christ, we all suffer. But we all have to be in there. Don't give up, because you're giving up on God and the power of the Holy Spirit. You can't do that.
An excellent way to end. Thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom and your vulnerability, your honesty. So on behalf of everyone gathered here this evening, thank you very much for a very powerful talk. It's really wonderful to hear. Thank you. At this point in our presentation, we're going to turn things over now to Bishop William McGrattan of Calgary, who's very generously participated in tonight's presentation and wants to offer a few concluding remarks. And as the bishop is getting himself ready to come on camera, perhaps Bishop McGrattan, we could ask you this before you give your formal remarks, if you respond to the question that was asked earlier that Sister Nuala diplomatically punted on to you is, and a few people have asked in the chat box to me privately, as the lay faithful, how can we best support our bishops and our clergy?
Well, thank you, Peter, and my thanks to Sister Nuala, St. Mary's University, for having the courage, I think, and the prophetic insight to host this most difficult but very pressing subject that is affecting the church, has affected the church, as Sister Nuala has mentioned. I'm encouraged, first of all, to be able to participate. As Sister Nuala mentioned, we go back a long way, and I can honestly say that what you said about her, Peter, is true. She's very candid, she's very honest, but as everyone has heard, she has a deep respect and a love for the church, and because of that, she has stayed with this issue for so long. And I would say that tonight's presentation is what I have witnessed in the past. Very sensitive, very probing, and also a very honest exposition of what she has come to discover through her own research. You know, it isn't just one issue, it's a number of issues that have come together. And yes, you can diagnose it, but you also have to understand that maybe there is a way of living, a culture that has precipitated this pathology, to use that image. And this wound has affected individuals, especially victims and families. She's mentioned that it's affected the clergy and bishops, and she's correct. And it has affected the lay faithful. I go back to your first image, Sister Nuala, of the picture of Jesus inviting Peter to walk on the water. Probably don't know this, but that is the icon that I have in my chapel. It was given to me when I was ordained a bishop from a member of Madonna House, and you're well aware of that. So it is an apt image. It speaks to us at different times, but especially when we don't have our eyes focused on Christ and we look to maybe the institution, maybe we don't see that the real church is Christ, manifest in the body of Christ, manifest, yes, in the role of shepherd, but it is the entire image of Christ that needs to be renewed. And we as bishops realize that that responsibility as leaders comes to us, and it has a great toll. And you have have mentioned that. I didn't realize how it has affected my brother bishops until I started to see many who have had very systemic, long-standing issues of clergy sexual abuse in their diocese. And I'm not saying that Calgary has not, but I do know that it hasn't been to the effect or the number, but that doesn't necessarily exonerate or say that we are better. Some of the most difficult things that I've had to do as a bishop is to meet with victims and families, to meet with priests, and to continually have the courage, and I think also the grace sometimes, is not to give into this this grief fatigue that, as you pointed out, is very prevalent. And when I see it and when I feel it in my ministry, I know sometimes it is coming from a culture, from within the church, but it also comes from the evil one. And I often see that is what we are confronting as well. And it takes the trust and the lament of an entire church to sort of recognize this evil and not to become judgmental of it, but also to honestly recognize it and to try and deal with it in a sensitive and compassionate way. You asked me a couple of things to maybe to respond to. The laity, and have asked through the questions, how can we support our priests, our bishops? I found in my own priesthood, it's those that have come to develop and want to develop in me, not only my gift of priesthood, but my humanity, and to establish friendships that are both nurturing and supportive. And where that has taken place in my own life and priesthood, I cherish them. And so I think that that's one of the things that our laity can do. Not to distance us, as you gave that image, and I've experienced the same thing in public settings where people make that judgment and walk away. And in this day and age, I guess I can, in resignation, say maybe they are justified. Maybe they themselves have been abused, and so they have the right to do that. But I also have worked with victims who, in a great way, have shown me the pain and suffering that this act of abuse of power, what the church has done in terms of its secrecy sometimes and hiding behind policies, it has not helped. And I think that that is why this new document, which we have, as you have said, and it's been laudatory of you, I've heard it over and over again at international gatherings of priests, that the Canadian bishops, and I think much to your credit and many of the lay people who have worked with you and the bishops, yes, developing these policies, but these policies have been recognized as being very prophetic, very forward thinking. The question then becomes is how do we put them into practice? How do we ensure in a mutuality that both the laity, the priests, and the bishops understand these and are making sure that they are being lived in a way that begins to change culture, to accept and need of reconciliation? All of what you have identified is true. Pope Francis, in our most recent visit a number of years ago, commented on what we had done. And I think that that in itself reflects on you. I think it reflects on many laity and dioceses that have formed committees that help with regard to dealing with issues of sexual abuse, try and prevent or create cultures of prevention. So much of what the Canadian Church has put in place is because of the laity. And they haven't been as passive. I know that you've sometimes described it that way. And no one would ever judge you as being passive. And so, you know, it is in that spirit that I think we, the bishops, have tried to be open and might use the word vulnerable, recognizing that we do not have all of the answers. We have trusted in professionals such as yourself, and we have relied on your advice, honesty, and insights to develop a document that hopefully can make sure that we're accountable. So part of this is I think your work and others, and I just want to express on behalf of the people who have joined to acknowledge that this is, now it's a document and it needs to be put into practice. The last thing, I guess, Peter, is that I would like to maybe just end with what Sister Nuala said, is that the culture is only going to change if we understand that we are to be the mission, the words, and the witness of Christ. And that, when it becomes more evident and more expressive in the life of our parishes, our church, our laity, our priests, our bishop, then we can begin to say that, yes, we're trying to be missionary disciples, as Pope Francis wants us to be. But in doing that, I think the big takeaway tonight is that we need to learn how to lament. And in that lament, and I'll go back to what you said, is that we begin to develop what is known as a proactive sense of hope. But that cannot come without this step of first lamentation, of accepting the pain, of recognizing that we need to do it not only individually, but as a whole church. And finding ways to do that, whether it be through this type of event of allowing people to listen and dialogue, whether it's in the context of liturgy, of prayer, whether it's in parish gatherings, whatever that might be, we do have to find creative ways to lament, and then also to provide people the support that they need to have that act of hope. And those are some of the new things that we're going to have to learn through COVID that you are pointing to as well. And so where there is a sense of loss, a sense of, as you say, denial that we're in this, a sense of conspiracy, whatever you want to sort of talk about, COVID has many lessons. And so that's something else that I think is important. And my last thing is maybe a plug, is that we, the Alberta bishops, have developed that pastoral letter on what are the lessons that we need to learn from COVID, and sort of raising up some of the church's social teaching. We're hoping that through this pastoral letter and the 7 weeks of reflection and panel discussion, we have purposely asked many of our laity here in Alberta to facilitate these types of discussion on what are the social teachings and the issues that we need to be aware of as Christians and Catholics for a new renewal of Christian living in our society. So I just want to encourage many of the participants, if you haven't been able to see this, is to go through Grandin Media and also begin to participate. Even Dr. Peter Baltutis, some of the professors of St. Mary's University, many others have been asked to participate in this pastoral initiative of the Alberta bishops. And I'm grateful for their willingness to stand with us. And I think that's the last thing that someone said, like, what can we do with you, for you bishops? I think if you can stand with us and we can stand with you, that's something that I think will give me a sense of encouragement and hope that, as Sister Nuala said, it's not easy to be a bishop. I don't think it's easy to be religious, to be family. There are all challenges, but we need to, in a sense, recognize that we can be there to support one another. So thank you for offering those reflections and maybe just responding to some of the questions that you punted to me. I'll join you tomorrow in the morning session. I have a permanent deacons. This life of technology, even though we're not traveling or going to these symposiums or these conferences, we're still doing it through technology, and it's as challenging and demanding.
Yep.
So it won't keep you up any longer with any of my comments. So you can get a good night's sleep, and we'll see you in the morning, okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bishop McGrattan. I thank you, first of all, for being here and giving of your time to be with us. I think it's a really important gesture that you're here with us to listen, to dialogue, and offer your words of wisdom. I think, everyone here tonight, we're gathered because we do want to stand with you. And we do want to be part of this community. We want to heal with you. So thank you for being here. It's really much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks.
All right. So we're now approaching the end of our evening. I just wanted to mention once again, our speaker, Sister Nuala Kenny, these are some of the books she mentioned tonight. There was Healing the Church was the first book. I guess the sequel, if you will, is called Still Unhealed. In between these books, she also published an award-winning book called Rediscovering the Art of Dying. And as she mentioned, she has a forthcoming book coming out called Being the Church During Pandemic. So if you want to follow Sister Nuala and the work she's doing, the really important work she's doing, this is the website, stillunhealed.ca. If you go there, you can see the kind of ministries she's involved in and follow along her publications. Moving forward, just a few small commercial announcements. As was alluded to earlier by several speakers, myself included, is if you want to continue this conversation, tonight's presentation kind of sets the framework for what's going on. But moving forward, tomorrow, we have a good chunk of the day with Sister Nuala. She's generously going to be talking with us and giving us a virtual workshop. It's called Lessons from Being Church in the Pandemic. And this is the brand new material, not published yet, she's working on. We're kind of her guinea pigs, if you will. It's called Prophetic Possibilities for Pastoral Conversion. She's doing 2 sessions tomorrow. The first one is called Lessons About Secrecy, Dialogue, and Morality. I'll be from 10:30 to 12 noon, and that will be Mountain Standard Time, of course. And then there's an hour break. We reconvene back at 1 p.m. for lessons about relationships, mission, and challenges from 1 to 2:30. If you want to join us for that conversation, this is the link. You can find it off the St. Mary's University homepage, but here's the link right here as well for you. The price for tomorrow's event is $25, and that gives you entry to both sessions. So